It was just another Monday morning when 15-year-old Ming Chen walked through the doors of Roosevelt High School. His stomach was turning with anxiety, just like it had been doing every day for the past 3 weeks since his family moved from Shanghai to this small American town. Ming adjusted his backpack, which was filled with his favorite math and science books. Back in Shanghai, he was always at the top of his class, but here, everything felt different. His mother's words from breakfast still rang in his ears. Stay strong, work hard, make us proud. He wanted to make her proud, but speaking in class had become his biggest fear. Ming's first class was advanced chemistry, taught by Mrs. Rodriguez, a teacher who always wore colorful scarves and had a warm smile. As he walked into the classroom, he could hear whispers and small laughs from a group of students in the back. Tyler Matthews, the school's basketball team captain, was doing what he thought was a funny imitation of how Ming had answered a question in last week's class. Please to repeat the chemical formula, Tyler said in an exaggerated accent, making his friends laugh louder. Ming slid into his seat in the front row, his cheeks burning red. He pulled out his notebook, which was filled with perfectly written notes. In fact, he understood all the concepts perfectly, but his accent made him a target every time he spoke. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed the commotion but hadn't yet found a way to address it effectively. She saw how Ming's hands shook slightly as he opened his textbook to today's chapter about chemical reactions. What no one in the class knew was that at home, Ming was a different person. He loved making funny videos about science experiments for his old friends back in Shanghai, helped his younger sister with her homework, and even taught his parents new English words he learned. But at school, he had become almost silent, speaking only when absolutely necessary. He focused on his work, trying to ignore the growing knot in his chest as he heard more whispers behind him. But this ordinary Monday was about to become the beginning of a change that nobody in room 204 saw coming, especially not Ming. As the class settled in, Mrs. Rodriguez wrote partner projects on the whiteboard, and Ming's heart sank even further. What happened next would set in motion a series of events that would not only change Ming's life, but would transform the entire school's culture in ways no one could have predicted. Mrs. Rodriguez's voice filled the quiet classroom as she explained the chemistry project that would take 6 weeks to complete. This will count for 40% of your final grade, she said, holding up a stack of colored papers. The whole class groaned, but Ming felt his heart beating even faster. Group projects were always the hardest, not because of the work, but because of the partnering process. In his old school, everyone wanted to be his partner because of his excellent grades, but here he already knew how it would go. As Mrs. Rodriguez started explaining the project details, Ming noticed something different in her voice. She wasn't just casually announcing it like other teachers did. I've already assigned the partners, she said firmly, which made everyone sit up straighter. Tyler's hand shot up immediately. But Mrs. R, we always get to choose our partners, he protested, looking back at his usual group of friends. Mrs. Rodriguez adjusted her bright orange scarf and smiled, but there was something determined in her eyes. Sometimes change is good, Tyler. Sometimes it's exactly what we need. She started reading out the pairs and Ming held his breath. Ming Chen, she paused, looking directly at him. You'll be working with Emily Parker. Ming turned slightly to look at Emily, who sat in the middle row. She was the school newspaper editor, always carrying a camera around her neck. And, unlike many others, she had never laughed at Ming's accent, but she had never spoken to him either. Emily's face showed surprise, but not disgust, which was already better than Ming had expected. The rest of the class time was spent with partners moving to sit together and discussing project ideas. Emily picked up her books and moved to the empty seat next to Ming. There was an awkward silence at first, broken only by the sound of papers shuffling. So, Emily said, tucking her long brown hair behind her ear, I heard you got the highest score on our last test. Ming nodded, surprised she knew this. Maybe we can start with your ideas? He said slowly, carefully pronouncing each word. What happened next caught Ming completely off guard. Instead of immediately jumping into the project, Emily pulled out her phone and opened a translation app. I thought this might help if we get stuck, she said with a genuine smile. Plus, I've always wanted to learn some Mandarin. Maybe you could teach me while we work. For the first time in weeks, Ming felt the tight knot in his chest begin to loosen just a little. But at the back of the classroom, Tyler and his friends were watching, and their expressions made it clear this project was going to be about much more than just chemistry. As the bell rang and students began packing up, Tyler accidentally bumped into Ming's desk, sending his perfectly organized notes scattering across the floor. Emily immediately bent down to help pick them up, but Ming couldn't help noticing her expression change as she saw something fall from Tyler's pocket. Something that would soon turn this simple class project into something much bigger than anyone expected. The next day in chemistry class, Ming arrived early, his backpack heavy with research materials for the project. He found Emily already sitting at their shared desk, fiddling with her camera. What caught his attention wasn't the camera, though. It was the small stack of sticky notes on her desk covered in wobbly Chinese characters. "I stayed up watching YouTube tutorials," Emily explained, her cheeks turning slightly pink. "I thought I'd learn how to write hello and thank you in Mandarin. They're probably terrible." Ming picked up one of the notes and felt a warm feeling spread through his chest. The characters were indeed a bit shaky, but they were readable. For the first time since coming to Roosevelt High, he let out a genuine laugh. "Not terrible," he said, then added with growing confidence, "But this line should curve like a river, not straight like a stick." He took out a pen and demonstrated on a fresh, sticky note. Emily watched intently, her camera forgotten. Their chemistry project was about chemical reactions in everyday life, but as they worked, something else was reacting too. Emily discovered that Ming had a YouTube channel back in Shanghai where he explained complex science concepts through funny experiments. "Wait, you're actually a YouTuber?" she asked, eyes wide with interest. Ming ducked his head shyly but pulled out his phone to show her. The videos were in Mandarin, but his experiments were engaging enough that language didn't matter, especially the one where he created a rainbow in a jar. Meanwhile, Tyler sat in the back of the class, his eyes frequently darting to Ming and Emily. He was partnered with James, who was more interested in his phone than the project. During their discussion, Tyler kept making loud, mocking comments about some people's English and staying in their own country. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed, her orange scarf swishing as she turned sharply toward the back of the room. But before she could say anything, something unexpected happened. Emily stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. She walked straight to Mrs. Rodriguez, camera in hand, showing her something on the small screen. The teacher's expression changed from concern to shock, then to something that looked like determination. Ming couldn't hear what they were discussing, but he saw Mrs. Rodriguez writing something down in her notebook, her hands slightly shaking. What Ming didn't know was that Emily's camera had captured more than just school newspaper photos yesterday. When Tyler had bumped into Ming's desk, she'd accidentally caught something on camera, something that would expose a much bigger problem at Roosevelt High. The photo wasn't just about Ming anymore, it showed a pattern that had been hidden in plain sight. As class ended, Mrs. Rodriguez called Tyler to her desk. Ming packed his bag slowly, watching from the corner of his eye. The teacher's voice was too low to hear, but Tyler's face went from confident to pale in seconds. On his way out, Emily grabbed Ming's arm excitedly. "Meet me in the library during lunch," she whispered. "There's something you need to see, and I think things are about to change around here." Ming walked to his next class, his mind racing. For the first time since starting at Roosevelt High, he felt something new growing inside him. Not just hope, but a spark of courage he thought he'd left behind in Shanghai. Little did he know that spark was about to ignite something much bigger than just a chemistry project. During lunch break, Ming made his way to the library, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. He found Emily at a corner table surrounded by old yearbooks and her laptop open to the school newspaper's website. Her usually neat hair was messy, like she'd been running her fingers through it while deep in thought. "Look at this," she said without even saying hello, her voice a mix of excitement and anger. Emily turned her laptop around. On the screen was the photo she'd accidentally taken yesterday. It showed Tyler dropping something as he bumped into Ming's desk. But it wasn't just any piece of paper, it was a list of names, Asian names. Below each name were cruel notes and planned pranks. Ming's name was there too, with yesterday's accident clearly pre-planned. His hands started trembling as he read through the list, recognizing names of other students who had quietly left Roosevelt High over the past year. "That's not all," Emily said. opening yearbooks from the past 3 years. She pointed to photos of different students, all from Asian backgrounds, all who had transferred out. They didn't just leave because they wanted to. They were bullied out, Ming. Tyler and his friends, they've been doing this for years. Nobody ever connected the dots because everyone left quietly. No one complained. Her voice cracked a little at the end. As they dug deeper, they found social media posts, old school newspaper articles about students transferring, and even a pattern in the school's official transfer records that Emily had gotten from her work on the newspaper. It wasn't just random bullying, it was organized, targeted, and had been going on for far too long. Ming felt sick to his stomach, but also strangely relieved. It wasn't just him. It had never been just him. Just then, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared between the bookshelves, her orange scarf now replaced with a serious expression. "I thought I might find you two here," she said quietly, pulling up a chair. She looked at the evidence spread across the table and took a deep breath. "I've been suspicious for a while, but I never had proof. Until now." She pulled out her own notebook, filled with dates and observations she'd been collecting. What happened next surprised both Ming and Emily. Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes filled with tears as she told them about her own experience as a Spanish-speaking student 30 years ago. "I promised myself that when I became a teacher, I would never let any student feel the way I did," she said, her voice firm despite her tears. "That's why I paired you two together. Emily, I've seen how you use your camera to tell the truth. And Ming, your silence speaks volumes, but maybe it's time for all of us to speak up." As they talked, a plan began to form, but just as they were discussing what to do next, Tyler and two of his friends walked into the library. They stopped dead when they saw the three of them huddled together, papers and evidence spread across the table. Tyler's face went from surprise to angry in seconds. He started walking toward their table, his fists clenched. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up, her small frame somehow seeming taller. But before she could say anything, something completely unexpected happened. Something that would change everything at Roosevelt High. Through the library windows, they could see the principal walking across the courtyard, accompanied by someone Ming recognized immediately. His heart nearly stopped when he realized who it was. Walking beside Principal Stevens was none other than David Chen, Ming's cousin and a successful civil rights lawyer from San Francisco. Ming hadn't told anyone that he'd emailed David last week in a moment of despair, sharing just a few details about his struggles at school. He never expected his cousin to actually show up. David had always been the family hero, known for fighting discrimination cases across the country. Now, seeing him through the library window in his crisp suit, Ming felt a mix of relief and fear. Tyler and his friends froze halfway to the table, their attention drawn to the window. Mrs. Rodriguez quickly gathered the evidence into her folder, her hands steady despite the tension in the air. Emily, thinking fast, had already snapped photos of everything with her camera. The sound of the library door opening made everyone turn. Principal Stevens walked in, followed by David, whose sharp eyes took in the entire scene. His young cousin surrounded by papers, the teacher standing protectively nearby, and the three boys caught in mid-stride. "Ming," David said in Mandarin, "I got your email." Then, switching to perfect English, he addressed the room. "I believe we all need to have a conversation about what's been happening at Roosevelt High." Principal Stevens looked confused but nodded, her face showing concern as she noticed the tension in the room. What no one expected was Tyler's reaction. For the first time, he looked genuinely scared. As they all moved to the principal's office, something remarkable happened in the hallway. Word had somehow spread rapidly through the school's messaging groups about the mysterious lawyer's arrival. Students began emerging from classrooms and the cafeteria. Among them, Ming spotted other Asian students he'd barely noticed before. They'd made themselves so quiet, so invisible, just like he had tried to do. In the principal's office, Emily spread out the evidence on the large conference table. The list that had fallen from Tyler's pocket, the yearbook patterns, the transfer records, and most damaging of all, screenshots of private group chats that someone had anonymously sent to the school newspaper's tip line that morning. Ming realized that other students must have been watching, documenting, waiting for a moment to speak up. David listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each piece of evidence. Principal Stevens sat shocked, her face paling as she realized what had been happening under her nose. Mrs. Rodriguez added her own observations, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. But the real surprise came when Tyler, looking at all the evidence laid bare, did something no one expected. "Wait," he said, his voice shaking slightly. He pulled out his phone and, after a moment's hesitation, pulled up a conversation. "You should see this too." He handed the phone to David. On the screen were messages from someone unexpected, someone whose identity would reveal that this problem went far beyond just the students at Roosevelt High. Ming watched as his cousin's eyebrows shot up reading the messages. David looked at Principal Stevens and said quietly, "We're going to need to call the school board." The room fell silent except for the sound of Emily's camera clicking, documenting this moment that would soon change not just Roosevelt High, but potentially schools across the district. But just as everyone thought they understood the full scope of the situation, Tyler stood up and said something that made Ming's heart stop. "There's more. And I think it's time I told the truth about why I really started all of this." His next words would reveal a connection between him and Ming that nobody could have possibly suspected. Tyler's hands were shaking as he began to speak. The small principal's office felt even smaller as everyone leaned in to listen. "4 years ago," he started, his confident mask completely gone, "I was the new student in Shanghai." The words hung in the air as Ming's eyes widened in surprise. Tyler continued, his voice getting quieter. "My dad was transferred there for work. I didn't know the language, couldn't understand anything, and I was bullied. Badly." Ming's mind raced back to his old school in Shanghai. He would have been in a different grade, but suddenly a memory surfaced. Glimpses of a tall, lost-looking Western boy in the hallways. Had that been Tyler? The same Tyler who now tormented others for their differences? "A group of students made my life horrible," Tyler continued, his voice cracking. "They copied my accent, excluded me from everything. I lost all my confidence, stopped speaking in class. After 6 months, my mom decided to move back here with me while my dad stayed in Shanghai. And He paused, looking down at his hands. "I promised myself I would never be the weak one again. So when I saw Ming walk into class that first day, all those feelings came rushing back. But instead of helping him, I became exactly like them." The room was silent. Emily had stopped taking photos, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck. Mrs. Rodriguez reached out and put a hand on Tyler's shoulder, her expression a mix of disappointment and understanding. David Chen was writing rapidly in his notebook, his legal mind already forming connections. But it was Principal Stevens who asked the critical question. "Tyler, you mentioned messages earlier. Who was encouraging this behavior?" Tyler looked up, tears in his eyes. "Coach Richards," he said quietly. "He saw how angry I was when I came back from Shanghai. He told me to toughen up by making sure I was on top. He's been helping us plan everything, telling us which students to target, how to make it look like normal teenage stuff." Ming felt like the room was spinning. Coach Richards was one of the most popular teachers at Roosevelt High, known for turning the basketball team into state champions. He was also on the district's diversity committee, which suddenly seemed darkly ironic. David Chen stood up, his lawyer persona fully engaged. "Principal Stevens, we need to see all communication between Coach Richards and the students. This goes beyond bullying. This is systematic discrimination being encouraged by a staff member." Principal Stevens nodded, looking both determined and devastated. Just then, Ming did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He walked over to Tyler and said in his accented English, "I understand. Being afraid changes people." Tyler looked up, meeting Ming's eyes for the first time without hostility. "But," Ming continued, his voice growing stronger, "being brave changes them too." Emily suddenly grabbed her camera, capturing this unexpected moment of connection. Mrs. Rodriguez wiped away tears, her orange scarf slightly askew. But this moment of understanding was interrupted by a loud knock on the office door. When it opened, Coach Richards stood there, his usual confident smile fading as he took in the scene before him, especially when he noticed David Chen's legal pad filled with notes. What happened next would test everyone in that room, as the true extent of the discrimination at Roosevelt High was about to be exposed. But more importantly, it would show how 2 former victims of bullying might just become the unlikely heroes of a story about change, redemption, and the courage to break cycles of hurt. Coach Richards' smile completely disappeared when he saw Tyler sitting there with red eyes. The coach's usual commanding presence seemed to shrink as he noticed the evidence spread across Principal Stevens' desk. "I was just coming to check on Tyler," he said, his voice carrying a nervousness no one had ever heard before. "He missed basketball practice." Before anyone could respond, David Chen stood up. "Actually, Coach Richards, your timing is perfect. We were just discussing your role in organizing systematic harassment of Asian students." The coach's face went from nervous to defensive in seconds. "That's a serious accusation," he said, trying to sound authoritative. "I'm on the diversity committee. I organize cultural awareness events. Like the Chinese New Year celebration last month?" Emily suddenly spoke up, her voice sharp. She pulled up photos on her camera. "Where you made the Asian students serve food while wearing stereotypical costumes." The photos showed everything, including handwritten notes from Coach Richards specifying which students should play their parts. Ming watched as Mrs. Rodriguez picked up one of Tyler's papers and started reading text messages out loud. Messages where Coach Richards had specifically instructed Tyler and other basketball players how to make their bullying look like normal teenage behavior. "Choose the quiet ones," one message read. "Make them feel like leaving is their own choice." Edit. The coach's face had turned pale, but then he did something unexpected. He laughed. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice getting louder. "Tyler, tell them. Tell them how I helped you become strong after what happened to you in China. Tell them how I made you team captain, how I'm helping you get sports scholarships." But Tyler stood up, his height matching the coach's. "No," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "What you did wasn't help. You took my pain and taught me to hurt others. That didn't make me strong. It made me exactly what I hated." Just then, a commotion outside the office drew everyone's attention. Through the glass door, they could see students gathering in the hallway. Word had spread fast. Among the crowd, Ming recognized faces. Not just Asian students, but students from all backgrounds, many holding phones showing screenshots of messages, evidence of their own experiences with the coach's subtle manipulation. Principal Stevens stood up, her authority finally matching her position. "Coach Richards, please wait in the conference room. The superintendent is on her way." But as the coach turned to leave, he looked directly at Ming and said something in broken, mocking Chinese. The same phrase he'd been teaching Tyler and the others to use as a taunt. What happened next happened so fast that Emily barely caught it on camera. Ming stepped forward, straight and tall, and responded in perfect English. "We're not afraid anymore. And we're not leaving." The hallway outside erupted in cheers that could be heard through the closed door. David Chen smiled proudly at his cousin, but his expression turned serious as he turned to Principal Stevens. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "What happened here is just the surface. We need to look at every school in the district." He pulled out a folder Ming hadn't noticed before. It contained similar reports from other schools, suggesting this problem went far beyond Roosevelt High. As Coach Richards was escorted to the conference room, Ming looked at Tyler, who seemed both broken and relieved. But there was something else happening, too. Something in the hallway that would turn this moment of exposure into a movement that would change everything. Through the office window, they could see students of all backgrounds gathering, phones in hand, ready to share their own stories. The next morning, Roosevelt High felt like a completely different school. The hallways buzzed with an energy no one had felt before. Emily's photos and initial story had been published in a special edition of the school newspaper, which students were reading on their phones and passing around in printed copies. But what made this morning truly different was the scene in the main hallway. Students had started putting up sticky notes on the walls, hundreds of them in every color imaginable. Each note contained a story, a message of support, or words in different languages saying, "You belong here." Ming stood reading them, his throat tight with emotion. Some notes were in Mandarin, written in the wobbly characters Emily had practiced. Others were in Spanish, Korean, Vietnamese, and languages Ming didn't even recognize. Mrs. Rodriguez walked by, now wearing a scarf with "Unity" written in multiple languages, stopping to add her own note about her experiences as a student. Tyler's basketball team had shown up wearing white armbands with "Stand Together" written in different languages. But what surprised everyone most was seeing Tyler himself, standing with a group of freshman Asian students, teaching them basketball during morning break. His usual group of friends had split. Some had joined him in trying to make things right, while others stood awkwardly at the edges, unsure of their place in this changing school. The superintendent's investigation was moving quickly. Coach Richards had been placed on administrative leave, and David Chen was working with a team of investigators looking into similar cases across the district. But something even more powerful was happening among the students themselves. The school newspaper's website had created a special section called Our Voices, where students could share their experiences anonymously. Stories poured in, not just about discrimination, but about finding courage, standing up and supporting each other. Ming was walking to chemistry class when he heard someone call his name. It was Sarah, a quiet girl from his English class who he'd barely noticed before. "Your story made me brave," she said softly, her slight Indian accent clear in her voice. "I've been hiding mine, too." She handed him a letter she'd written to the principal, detailing her own experiences with subtle discrimination. Ming felt a mix of sadness and pride as he read it. In chemistry class, Mrs. Rodriguez had rearranged all the seats into small circles instead of rows. "Today," she announced, "we're going to learn about catalysts, things that create change without being changed themselves." She looked meaningfully at Ming and Emily. Sometimes the smallest actions can start the biggest reactions. As they worked on their chemistry project, Ming and Emily noticed something remarkable. Students who had never spoken to each other were now talking, sharing stories, and even laughing together. The invisible barriers that had divided the school seemed to be dissolving. But just as everyone thought things were getting better, Ming's phone buzzed with a message that made his heart sink. It was from his parents, and what they had to say would force him to make the hardest decision of his life. At the same time, Tyler was facing his own crisis. His father, still working in Shanghai, had finally learned about everything that had happened. His response would add an unexpected twist to the story that no one saw coming. As Ming read his parents' message again, he realized that the biggest test of courage wasn't in standing up to bullies. It was in what he would have to do next. Ming stared at his phone, reading his parents' message for the 10th time. His father had been offered a promotion, one that would mean moving back to Shanghai immediately. "You can finish school where you feel safe," the message read. "We understand if you want to come home." 3 weeks ago, this would have been exactly what Ming wanted. Now, everything was different. At lunch, Ming found Emily in the newspaper office working on a follow-up story about the changes at Roosevelt High. Her desk was covered with photos, Tyler teaching basketball to younger students, the wall of sticky notes, students from different backgrounds eating lunch together. When Ming told her about his parents' message, she stopped typing mid-sentence. "But you can't leave," she said, her voice cracking. "Not now. You're changing things here." Meanwhile, Tyler was dealing with his own family crisis. His father had sent him a long email from Shanghai describing how he'd witnessed Ming's cousin David Chen on Chinese national news, talking about the Roosevelt High case. The story had spread internationally. "I was there when you were bullied," his father wrote. "I ran away by sending you and your mom back home. But you chose to become a bully instead of helping others who felt like you did. We need to talk about this." That afternoon, a surprising group gathered in Mrs. Rodriguez's classroom after school. Ming, Emily, Tyler, and several other students who had started sharing their stories. They were planning a district-wide student summit about inclusion, something that had never been done before. Ming sat quietly, the weight of his decision heavy on his mind. "I might be going back to Shanghai," he finally said during a pause in the planning. The room fell silent. Tyler, who had been writing ideas on the board, turned around so quickly he dropped the marker. "You can't," he said, surprising everyone with the intensity in his voice. "I did exactly that. I ran away. It doesn't fix anything." Just then, David Chen appeared in the doorway. He'd been in meetings with the district board all day, but something in his expression said this wasn't about the investigation. "Ming," he said in Mandarin, "I just spoke with your parents." He switched to English so everyone could understand. "They're letting you make the choice, but there's something else you all need to know." David explained that the story had grown bigger than anyone expected. Schools across the country were starting to examine their own handling of discrimination. News channels wanted to interview the students. Educational experts were calling it the Roosevelt Revolution. But with this attention came pressure, and some people weren't happy about their comfortable systems being challenged. Last night, David continued, someone vandalized the wall of sticky notes. The room erupted in angry murmurs. But, he held up his hand, what happened this morning was remarkable. He pulled out his phone and showed them a video. Dozens of students had shown up early, rewriting every single note that had been destroyed. Among them were faces they never expected to see, including some of Tyler's old friends, who had stood on the sidelines until now. Ming looked around the room, at Emily with her camera that had captured truth, at Tyler who had found the courage to change, at Mrs. Rodriguez who had noticed and cared, at all the students who were no longer hiding. Then he looked back at his phone, at his parents' message asking him to choose. Standing up, Ming took a deep breath. His accent was still there, but his voice was strong as he said the words that would change not just his future, but the story of Roosevelt High forever. But just as he finished speaking, the school's emergency alarm began to blare, and through the windows they could see something that made their blood run cold. Through the classroom windows, they could see smoke rising from the parking lot. Coach Richard's supporters, a group of angry parents and former students, had gathered outside the school. Someone had set fire to a pile of protest signs that students had made for the upcoming district summit. The smoke was black against the afternoon sky, but what was more frightening were the shouts and angry faces. Ming's heart was racing, but his voice remained steady as he finished what he had been saying. I'm staying. This is where I belong now. This is where we all belong. Emily's camera clicked rapidly, capturing the moment just as Principal Stevens' voice came over the intercom, calmly instructing everyone to stay in their classrooms. Tyler stepped forward, his face pale but determined. Those are my dad's business partners out there, he said, recognizing some faces in the crowd. They're the ones who supported sending me back from Shanghai. They think they're protecting their kids just like my parents thought they were protecting me. He pulled out his phone and did something no one expected. He called his father, putting him on speaker. As the angry shouts outside grew louder, Tyler's father's voice filled the quiet classroom, speaking from Shanghai. He told everyone about how he had regretted his silence when Tyler was bullied there, how running away had taught his son the wrong lesson. But today, his voice cracked with emotion. I'm watching my son become the person I wish I had been. Mrs. Rodriguez moved quickly, using her colorful scarf to wipe tears from her eyes as she headed for the door. They need to see, she said firmly. They need to see what we've really built here. Before anyone could stop her, she walked out of the building and straight toward the angry crowd, her scarf flowing behind her like a flag. What happened next would be remembered at Roosevelt High for years to come. One by one, students began following her. First Ming and Tyler, walking side by side, then Emily with her camera, then dozens more, emerging from classrooms throughout the building. They formed a line facing the protesters and began putting up new sticky notes on the outside walls of the school. But these weren't just messages of support. They were their stories, their pain, and their hopes, written where everyone could see them. David Chen stood at the top of the school steps, his legal pad forgotten as he watched his young cousin stand tall in the face of anger. Principal Stevens joined him, and together they saw something remarkable unfold. The angry shouting began to die down as protesters stopped to read the stories on the wall. Some of their own children were in that line of students, sharing stories their parents had never heard. Tyler's father, still on speakerphone, was broadcasting the scene live in Shanghai, where Ming's old classmates were watching. Messages of support started pouring in from around the world. Emily's photos and stories were being shared across social media, showing how one school's transformation was inspiring others to face their own hidden prejudices. The smoke from the burning signs slowly cleared, revealing not a scene of conflict but one of transformation. Coach Richard's supporters began to leave, some in anger but others in quiet reflection. As the sun set behind Roosevelt High, Ming looked at the wall of stories now stretching around the entire building. His own story was there, written in both English and Mandarin. But it was no longer a story of being bullied. It was a story of change, of courage, and of finding home in unexpected places. 1 year later, Roosevelt High would become a model for schools nationwide in handling discrimination and promoting genuine inclusion. The sticky note movement would spread to schools across the country, Tyler would become a speaker at educational conferences, sharing his journey from bully to advocate. Emily's photos would win national awards. And Ming? He would graduate as class president, his accent still present, but now speaking with a confidence that inspired others to find their own voices. But on that afternoon, as the crowd dispersed and the emergency vehicles left, Ming, Tyler, Emily, and Mrs. Rodriguez stood together looking at their school. Ming picked up one last sticky note that had fallen to the ground. On it, in wobbly Chinese characters and careful English, was written a simple truth. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't standing up to others. It's standing up as yourself.